Hello everyone, welcome to Tattva, Conversations and Explorations. We have concluded our second series, which focused on language and understood many interesting things about it, from what language is, to how it changes, and how it can also die. We spoke to 7 linguists, among them a philosopher of language, and 2 language revivalists, and would like to once again extend our heartfelt gratitude towards them for sharing their time and knowledge. Here are some of the many questions they answered for us. Hope you find them interesting.
I want to start with this very basic of humans, which is anything that is given to us in abundance or anything that is natural to us. We don't consciously value such things available to us in abundance. And due to time constraint, I don't want to take you through so many examples, but one can fill in the blanks. You can begin with what natural resources we have and how we treat natural resources. And all the way to the personal stuff, as general sayings go in many languages. If you want to understand importance of eyesight, you need to talk to someone who can't see, not to the people who can see. We take it so lightly. In fact, we at times don't take care of our eyes properly. We don't worry what goes in it, whether we need to wash it or not. And likewise, it goes to many things. Language is nature to us in that sense, and therefore it means that language is natural to us. And when I say people don't care about what is available or given to us in abundance, I don't mean to complain or lament on it. I'm only talking about that also is natural. It's not that we are consciously not taking care of something. It is natural. Being complacent about what's around us and longing for what's not around us is natural. So it's not a complaint about one versus many or one group to others, or even a specialist talking about anything in particular. I remember one sentence from a very famous sentence and very philosophically grounded sentence from a Hindi poet who says, I don't remember the full thing, but I remember only things that were relevant to me. Jo alabh jo dur usi ko adhik chahta mane. Meaning, what is not accessible, that is alabh, and dur, what is distant from us, we want only that. In other words, we don't value what is close to us, what is available to us. And that's very natural for everybody, for society, humans, and so on. So having said that much, language is indeed natural to us, and it is one of the things that defines humans. It's that close to us, to our existence, at all levels of our interactions with ourselves and our interactions with anything else is contingent upon language. When I say it defines our existence, I only mean in that sense. Now, what is it? A very common question that comes to classes, that comes to discussions, and comes to my mind as well. And I would at least honestly raise that question to you. Not sure how convincingly I answer that question, but at least it is important for people to see. The most common available, the most commonly available definition of language, if you look around and if you talk to people, they will tell you language is a medium of communication. And there is nothing wrong about it. Language indeed is a medium of communication. We know there are when we go into the details of communications, we know there are theories, there are studies which says language, when you are looking at something or somebody, you only understand that thing or that person to the maximum possible extent of 25%, if you can quantify your understanding, through what the person speaks. Rest of the things about the situation or the person comes to you from variety of other things. That's the distinction between verbal and non-verbal communication researchers and linguists make. But that's about communication. So we come back to that again, and we move further from where I was saying language is indeed a medium of communication. There is no doubt about that. Moving beyond, the natural question arises from there. If it is the medium of communication and a very powerful medium of communication indeed, even though only 20% or 25% comes out of our understanding, shapes up through verbal medium, still a very powerful medium, then why do people speak so many different languages? Would it not be very normal for people all over the world, they just spoke one language? We can still be as different from others as we want to be and speak the same language so that communication becomes easier and we don't have to make any effort for talking to others. I don't have a very convincing answer to this question, and I confess it. However, adequate answer to this question or not, either way, it tells you that language is way more than that. Language cannot be limited only to communication. I remember a very famous instance when Einstein was asked about his scientific achievements at some point. He probably in a different language told the person who asked him this question that if you look at scientific developments as ocean, I don't think I have stepped into it. I'm still at the source of this ocean. I don't know what lies within. I would not want to extrapolate that, but it comes very close to that. Whatever we know about our innate capability that we know as language, we know very little about it. And whatever little we know about it, it's just the beginning of it. When it is way more than that, how can we rationalize or explain it for people to understand what we mean? Way more than that. You see, and here is what where we can at least begin. Despite several differences across languages, let me put it this way. As a linguist with responsibility, I can tell you, nobody across the world knows the total number of languages is spoken as we speak. We can only have an estimate about it. And again, I want to add a footnote to that. This is not a complaint against anybody. We have huge material available online in the modern time. As we started discussing language is natural and commonly available entity to humans, you will not find anybody. If you ask a question about language to anybody that you come across, you won't find a single person who will tell you, I don't know anything about it. I can't tell you anything about it. People will have a position on language. People will have something to say about language. It's that common a thing. But we don't know the total number of languages spoken around the world or even within India. And that confirms our understanding that language is not a countable entity. We can look at names and therefore can say, we can talk about number of languages from its identity and names. But language indeed is not a countable entity, because it is so flexible, so adaptable, that it changes after every now and then.
One thing it might to bear in mind is the Brothers Grimm, famous for the Brothers Grimm's fairy tales. I don't, they talked a lot about the evolution of language. Their fairy tales were specifically illustrative of how languages would change over time. So, so maybe the first idea that we have to get rid of is that language is something static. Like all of life, it's always in movement. Whether it's evolving or devolving is another question. Language is always in movement, is it not? So suddenly, as you say, a particular film will become popular, a particular work of art, and suddenly everyone in Pondicherry will be using the word amigo. My experience up in the Himalayas is these kind of television serials from Korea are very popular. So you'll go around all these schools in places like Kalimpong and Darjeeling, and you find all these teenage girls speaking in Korean. Because they've got a whole world of meaning now that's coming out of these kind of very well done long Korean serials. So yes, there is this element, and obviously that's part of the evolution of language. So they're speaking mainly Nepali, but then they're throwing in Korean words, and then they'll have their own vernacular languages as well, like Lepcha or Bhutia or Tibetan. And then when the British Empire was here, it brought the whole world of Europe in through the medium of English. English became a very dominant kind of connecting tongue of what we call India as a single modern country. Though of course throughout history, India is often many countries, like Europe is sometimes just one country. Now there's an EU, so Europe is kind of one thing, but throughout its history, it's many countries. So this is interesting. These questions of how language evolves are obviously tied up with all these different things. Now, when you get to the religious language particularly, there seems to be a specific kind of preservation. In, for example, all through Tamil Nadu, Sanskrit is something that's preserved in a very specific form with great discipline to preserve something in some particular form. Now, of course, Sanskrit evolves too, and there's Sanskrit from different eras and so on like that. But perhaps at the time a lot of these great Sanskrit institutions were founded, a certain kind of teaching came in that would make the Sanskrit very strictly in a certain form. And it's preserved almost through robotic memorization of a certain style of Sanskrit. You don't allow amigo to suddenly appear within. They're saying, oh, people are throwing amigo into Sanskrit. What a sacrilege. They'll say it's a watering down of some kind of particular, very noble version of Sanskrit that needs to be preserved for whatever reason. Latin was like this in, of course, in the Latin church, or Greek in the Orthodox church. As the language most of the scriptures are in Greek, so ancient Greek. So yes, so from that side, whatever we were calling the religious, or the sacramental side of the civilization, language has this almost de-evolutionary quality, where it actually tries to preserve some kind of like its high voice. It tries to preserve a noble voice. In Japan, for example, a country I lived in for very long, there's very many levels of polite Japanese which stay absolutely the same. And when you're in that culture, it's very formal. And when you use that language, it's very formal. And the matter of what you're talking about is far less important than the way that you talk about it. The specific language you use, the specific gesture with a specific word, it's preserving something. So maybe we could say that there's a preservative aspect of language. Whereas when you get down to street Japanese in Osaka Fish Market, you'll find amigo and all sorts of things are popping up. People are very loose with the language. The language becomes quite percolating and creative. full of juice, full of it's evolving in different directions. Languages, that vernacular language can like disappear. It can evolve into something else and come back. Like when I grew up in California in the 1970s, and all this rock music of the 1970s was a very powerful influence then, and the culture followed it. And then suddenly I was quite surprised when I was teaching children in Europe in the 2000s that they'd gone completely back to 1970s language, and they were speaking like the world that I grew up in, which had disappeared and then come back again. And all the music they didn't like any music after the 1970s, but everything from the 1960s and 1970s, Bob Dylan or Rush or Led Zeppelin, all this stuff that I grew up with suddenly had come back and become a popular music, and they didn't like the music that was currently
going on.
So perhaps we could say the vernacular culture and its creativity, it goes through cycles, but it also comes back to things that it did before. And yet, when you talk about the Sanskrit temples of, Madurai or something, they're carrying on for centuries and centuries. So the mood of that place preserves a culture in a very long-term form, which is another interesting aspect of it. So this question of evolution of language, I don't know if I've answered it well, but it certain aspects, I would say it evolves and it de-evolves. And obviously the global civilization we have now with its greatly technologized language, technology tends to govern the way language and communication move. That itself has evolved to a certain point. And yet now people are almost crying for local languages again. They're tired of everyone. I mean, if I can just give one example, where I am in the Himalayas, there's been an absolutely radical shift in the culture there in Sikkim since YouTube and high-speed internet has appeared. Overnight, in giving a young, let's say, Sikkimese child a phone, where the parents encourage her to watch YouTube because it makes their English better. She's entering a whole world of Californian YouTube culture, including whole values and ways of being that are so far from the Sikkimese tradition for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that there's a real gap between the parents and the children. And then the children's desire isn't really, they start seeing Sikkim as a prison and they just want to flee. So the whole culture then suddenly becomes non-local. Their whole thing is to get high enough marks in the school that they can get to some big city and then get to some other country and then finally maybe they'll get to the home of where YouTube came from and their culture. And their own culture of lamas and Buddhas and all these things feels very foreign and exotic to them, even though it's right down the street. Or their own grandfather was a lama, who's part of this Gompa or something like that. So a radical shift in language has taken place with this cell phone and with technology, with the whole world as suddenly becoming Californian. So is that an evolution of language or a devolution of language? Or it's an interesting question, isn't it?
Languages change all the time. There are continuous processes of erosion, so that, for example, words are pronounced less carefully, they're pronounced in a shorter way, some sounds are left out, and at the end you have something that seems to have a lot less structure. So if I give an example from the English language, so I can express future time with the be going to construction, and I can say, I'm going to talk to Jasper this afternoon. But I can also shorten that to say, I'm going to talk to Jasper this afternoon, or even shorter, I'm going to talk to Jasper this afternoon. Now, given this process, is it possible that language just over time crumbles into a piece of dust and there is nothing left? And speakers are no longer able to express the meanings that they want to convey. Now, the erosion process is real, but at the same time, new structures are always coming into languages. So speakers come up with new ways of expressing old meanings. So for example, be going to was actually an alternative to expressions of future time that were already available. like the auxiliary will, for example. And you notice that will, for example, is already much smaller and has much less phonetic substance. So when I say, I'll talk to Jasper this afternoon, it's really just that one consonant.
Yeah.
And so linguists have been observing this in lots and lots of languages, that new constructions, new expressions, both lexical words, but also these grammatical markers, like, for example, markers of future time, emerge and become integrated into the grammatical inventory of a language. So language is continuously renewing itself, and the complexity that is lost on one end is actually gained at another end. And in this way, the potential, the communicative potential of language is actually maintained in every language that linguists have studied. So we are not aware of any language that would have collapsed or deteriorated to a degree where communication was no longer possible. With one exception, languages that are spoken only by very few speakers so that they die out. Yeah. So imagine a language that is maybe spoken in a remote village, and the language is no longer taught to children growing up, but it is exclusively spoken by older speakers. And then maybe those older speakers don't talk much to one another. Yeah. So there you can have situations in which those languages become less expressive or lose some of their richness and variety. Yeah, and of course, the end result would be that a language is no longer spoken by anyone at all, and in that case, the language dies. So that, unfortunately, is the case with almost half of the languages that are spoken on Earth today. Are likely to disappear within the next 2 generations. That is actually a quite dramatic development that is happening under our eyes, really.
So I'll give maybe first a couple examples of maybe how my language has shapes the worldview or way of looking at things. So, for example, in Ojibwe, my language, a Native American language spoken in the Great Lakes region of the United States and Canada, there are words for an elder. Gichiaya'a literally means a great being. Our word for an elderly woman, Mindemuye, means one who holds things together, and maybe describes the role of the family matriarch. In English, we have words like old woman, elderly woman, aged woman, and then insulting words like hag or something. And I think in Ojibwe, you don't really have to say respect your elders. It's kind of built right in with any word you could use to talk about them. And so that doesn't mean that we should romanticize or denigrate any language or culture. All of us humans have problems and beauties to our languages and ways. But at the same time, I think there's a very distinct way of holding up and honoring elders. And to me, that is reflected in many other parts of our language and culture. So we have this description about 4 phases of life: babies, young people, adults, elders, and that we pray for people to see all of those seasons, to get to be of advanced years. If a young person does a favor, like a chore for one of their elders, the elder might touch their head and touch the kid's head and say, "Wabe kwan bejikaminen, I'm giving you a white hair." And it's a way of saying, you get to be an elder too someday. You're going to get there one good deed at a time. Thank you, and keep going, And as a result, the message becomes that your value is what you give to others, rather than what you keep for yourself. And that the goal is to become an elder. And I think in the English speaking world, we tell people you should be 20 forever, and people dye their hair and get a facelift and a Botox injection. They won't admit how old they really are. They feel shame when they age. And I'm not sure that that's a healthy way to be. And it intersects with sexism, where we tell women your primary value is being young and sexually attractive so you can get a man, because having a man is the only thing that's of value. You know, it's a very unhealthy message. And we tell men that your primary value is getting more money than someone else so you can get a young woman. You know, like it's very, very unhealthy. And I think within some of the world's other languages and cultures, you have some other things that are valued. I certainly see that in the Ojibwe world. And I think that's worth centering. It's one thing, and you can do this well in English, to point out what's wrong with English systems and thought patterns. But if you have nothing to hold in its place, then how can you really shift your thinking and learn from one another, as other people have other ways of doing it? You know, like sometimes English doesn't have vocabulary words for common things, like whatever, Schadenfreude, a German word to receive your laughs at someone else's expense, you know. And you know, so any language might have ways of framing or looking at things that can give us perspective and be worth keeping.
I'm a little bit hesitant to make sweeping generalizations about what common people, the common man, as you would say, think about these things. But to make a couple of, you know, very weak, suggestive kind of hypotheses, conjectures, it might be something like this. I think many of us probably have two different streams of thought about language that aren't quite the same and might actually be in a little bit of tension with each other, but they might both be part of common sense anyway. One is language is a tool for conveying your thoughts. I think most people, if you were to just go around with a clipboard and ask people to answer your questions on the street, if you ask them, is language a tool for conveying your thoughts? Most people would say, yes, of course. So that's probably part of common sense. But I also think, and this is, I think, come to be the case more and more in the last maybe 10 or 15 years, people are more self-conscious of the ways in which language can be used to harm and to marginalize and to treat people in unfair ways and unjust ways and so forth. So think about the ways in which people are sensitive now to the pronouns that are used to discuss people who have made various choices about how they want to live their lives. And people take pronoun use as an important way of indicating where they stand on things. And whereas, in my experience, at least 25 years ago, the majority of everyday folks might not have taken that seriously as something that they need to spend time worrying about. Seems to be now that's more part of our consciousness, something that matters. Likewise, there's been a lot of scholarly interest as well as public interest in the use of various kinds of charged language, including pejoratives and slurs. And I think nowadays, unlike what was the case when I was a kid, growing up in the 60s and 70s, people are more conscious of the ways in which those types of words can be used to harm, in which they can be used to make people victims and so forth. So it seems to me, and that is kind of, even though it might have started out as more of a scholarly kind of highbrow kind of study, I think it has become more widespread as something people, high school kids and nurses and lawyers and teachers and so forth are conscious of as ways in which they want to be careful about not just what they say, but how they say it. So it seems to be in the last maybe quarter century, people, at least in the cultures to which I've had exposure, have become more self-conscious about the ways in which they speak in order to be more respectful of others. And I think that's a good thing. If you read a novel from the 1920s, for example, you're probably, if it's about everyday folks as opposed to aristocratic people or something, even then you might find it this way. But if you were to read a novel from 100 years ago, you probably would find people describing people of different ethnicities and nationalities with various slurs and various prejudices and various stereotypes and so forth. The Italians are like this, and the Greeks are like that, and the Irish are like this, and so forth. It seems constant in many areas of literature from about 100 years ago and before, whereas that sort of thing was considered much less acceptable now. that's a way in which, on the one hand, I think many of us, in a matter of common sense, say language is for conveying your thoughts. But I also think many of us, commonsensically, would say, but we should be careful how we convey those thoughts, because sometimes words can hurt. And that seems to me to be it's a bit of progress, I think, in popular culture, is I think people are coming to realize that yes, indeed, what words you use can be hurtful, and we should be more self-conscious about those things.
When people say, oh, you're a linguist, that means you're correcting my grammar, or you're, how should I say this? What's right? What's correct? And my response to that is that linguists don't do that. They look at language like they look at other phenomena in the world, rock formations, etc. The task is not to say what language should be, but to see it as an observer, not interfere with it, not judge anything about it, just look at it like you would anything in the world if you're a scientist. And so that comment is inspired by that idea, that to turn it around so that the assumption isn't what's correct, what's right, what should language be, and transform it to what is it. Now, what you're asking me then is, so what is it? And that is very hard to say simply, well, this is what it is, this is what the system is, because it is an ongoing project, and linguistics is sort of new as that kind of science, in that the task of uncovering, so what is grammar, isn't something that's been settled. What we know is that grammar is a system that all languages have. And is there anything that all languages have in common? Is there a universal, like they all have this? That we can't even say. Perhaps something like, they all have verbs. That's maybe. But every time you try to come up with something like, oh, all languages do this, you will find some small language in Papua New Guinea or something that, no, they actually do it this way. So there aren't rules, the particular grammar rule, we can say that all languages do this, but we can say they all are rule governed. What we end up doing more is what seems like something no language would do, like random ordering each time you make a sentence. That's probably not going to happen.
Random ordering. What exactly?
Languages generally have either subject, verb, object, or subject, object, verb, or object, verb, subject. All of those permutations are existing, but you won't have a language where it does it randomly differently every time. However, you might have a language that marks each of those things with an ending, so that you can put it in any order, but you'll know whether it's the subject, verb, or object because of the ending that's stuck on it. So yeah, this is when it starts to be difficult to not talk about it technically, because you want to say, well, yeah, all languages are systematic, but there will be exception. Anytime you say you found this rule, there'll be some exceptions to that rule too. So it's systematic, but not unable to deviate from whatever system you found. Right. So it's complex and changing, but also there are things that would be surprising to a linguist. And I've worked with constructed languages, languages that people make up. And if you make up a language that's too perfect in its system, that sometimes will seem like this doesn't seem natural. It's not how a natural language would be. So if you try to come up with like a perfect system where the rule is the same every time, it will be language-like, but maybe sort of obviously not natural language.
A revivalist must have balls of steel. And when I say balls of steel, I don't mean you need to be a man. You can be a woman, like Golda Meir. She was the prime minister in Israel. They said she's the only person with balls so balls in a metaphorical sense. Yeah. You need to have a heart of gold, because if you don't have a heart of gold, you will never survive. And you need to have the patience of a crocodile or of a saint. Crocodiles are very patient. They can wait for you for 4 days. Right. They can look at you for 4 days, and then after 4 days they attack. If you're on a tent, you say, "Oh, nobody attacked me until now. It's okay." No, they will attack you after 4 days. And the fourth thing, unfortunately, you need to have the willingness or the humility, the humbleness to serve as a punch bag. Because when you work with people who are especially disadvantaged or unprivileged, poor, I'm not saying, there might be some minorities who are very rich, I'm sure there are, but usually I work with kind of miserable, in quotation marks, poor people who have been screwed by colonizers, etc. There is a lot of ressentiment.
Trust issues.
Say it again?
They'll have some trust issues, for the lack of a better word.
Not trust as much as resentment. Yeah, they trust me wholeheartedly, but they resent some other people. But it will be projected towards whoever is around. It's a little bit like if you go to a house where they're fighting. Then you suddenly come, they will kind of punch you because who else can they punch? Look, it's not easy, but it's necessary. And I would like to tell your friends or your followers or the audience that if you are good at foreign language learning, which means if you have 7 characteristics, because you need 7 characteristics for foreign language learning: mathematicity, musicality, outstanding memory, high IQ, high EQ, shamelessness, and motivation. If you have these 7 characteristics, you're good at foreign language learning. Consider learning one language. I'm not saying you can learn many languages. I'm fluent in 13 languages and I know many others. Consider learning one language that is dead or sleeping or dreaming beauty, whatever you want to call it, extinct. Learn one language out of all the languages you learn, and then do it together with the community, with the custodians. Of course, if they don't want you to learn, don't learn, because this is not a laboratorial endeavor.
It'll be great to know your thoughts on these conversations. Do comment and let us know. After language, our journey continues with physics. Join us in May and June as we sit down with physicists and philosophers of physics to understand the Tattva, or essence of physics. Thank you for being here. Goodbye. Take care.